Hello, hello, hello. Shalomi, my homies, and welcome to another episode of Killing the Church. You know what it is we do here. We talk about doctrines that are killing the church and things that need to be killed in the church. Today is actually mostly a history lesson. And I've got, of course, my compatriot, Brad, here to join me in giving this particular introduction to actually what is a 5-part series called The Sex Talk. So today's just the introduction. But we will actually focus on all of the groups that we're going to talk about today in the introduction on dedicated episodes with the ultimate goal actually of really breaking down the Shammai versus Hillel thing that people love talking so much about that really a lot of people actually don't know as much as they think they know about that. And so we're going to break a lot of stuff down with the ultimate goal of getting to that particularly. So, but once again, welcome to the podcast brought to you by Alternate Media and of course brought to you by all of our lovely Patreon supporters. I'm gonna bring them up here right now as a quick little show. So this episode is actually brought to you by you guys. You guys have asked tons of questions that have essentially led to this particular topic being a series. So I think that's it for the intro. So now, Bradley, what are you drinking?
So I picked up something just before showtime, and it was hard. It was a hard choice to make. It's a brand I've not tried before called Amador.
Oh, you're not a door though.
No, but it also, well, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it.
Hey,
yeah, there you go. But it is aged in or finished in Cabernet Sauvignon barrels. Now, there was another bottle right beside this one. It's a little lighter, and it's finished in Chardonnay barrels, which I thought that might be interesting, but I'm not a fan of Chardonnay myself, so I figured we'll go with the Cabernet Sauvignon, and that's going to be a winner.
I love a good Cab Sav.
Yes.
I am actually decided to just go for a simple beer today. So just having a Sam Adams, always a good decision. The Holiday White Ale came out recently, and these are I love these seasonal beers so much. So I'm just taking advantage of it while I have it.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, and yeah, I don't know. I was in a beer mood today. I was sort of like, I like whiskey. Don't get me wrong, but I just wasn't feeling whiskey when I came home.
Not feeling it today?
Not when I came home today. It's, I, whatever, work and everything. Wasn't like a rough day at work. Got to have a whiskey. But an easy day at work, I'm like, I'm just going to have a beer.
Just chill. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, so all of our real quick announcements, of course. Don't forget to hit the like button, or bless the like button, and believe in the subscribe button. Ring the bell if you want to be notified of all congregational activities that we do here. It's ring the church bell.
I like that. Ring the church bell.
And if you're drinking with us tonight, please do so, but do so responsibly. And if you are, comment what you are drinking. Let us know what's going on. You got any recommendations? Give them to us. Maybe we'll give them a try. And as always, as the show progresses, ask your questions in the chat.
Yes.
And here's the thing, too. With this particular introduction, we're going to try and be at a very basic level, but this is going to spark many questions. I'm certain of it. And that's what I like about doing a live show when we do stuff like this that has a pretty historical nature, is that we can actually address certain questions. And you can't really do that with a pre-recorded video. And so this gives us a chance to actually interact with you, the viewer, and also answer questions that we just maybe didn't touch on, and gives us a chance to touch on those things.
Absolutely.
So, all right. And we'll save the rest of the announcements
also, right?
Say again?
We're doing the book giveaway also, right?
We are, and we can go ahead and show what that is right now. I was just going to show it at the end, but this month's book giveaway, which will be announced on December the 28th, is one of my personal favorite books, Paul Was Not a Christian, The Original Message of a Misunderstood Apostle, by Professor Pamela Eisenbaum. She teaches at Ohio State, I believe. And to enter into this drawing, it's a random drawing. Anyone can win. Is if you are a supporter at any level, you can support us at the $1 level or at the whatever dollar amount. As soon as you become a supporter at any level, you are automatically entered in for that drawing. So that will be announced December 28th, and then January's book will be announced immediately after that. We got some suggestions in this chat. Wonderful. Wunderbar. All right. So all that, all of our, opening nonsense out of the way.
Main topic.
Yeah. So, again, so this is an introductory to what will be a 5-part series.
Personally, one of the reasons I think this is an important series is a lot of times, especially in the discussions that you and I tend to get involved in, reference to the generic first century Judaism will often get brought up. And now, of course, when we refer to first century Judaism, usually we are referring to the Pharisee movement. And we will often be met with contention that, there were numerous sects of Judaism at the time. And so, you can't just pigeonhole it that way. And I have a separate argument for why that's not a good argument. But this is one of the reasons we'll be going over the different sects of Judaism.
And again, this is an introduction. So we're actually just going to be going over the broad categories of some of the sects of Judaism. And within each of the categories that we're going to go over tonight, there are subcategories or their own individual sects within this particular sect movement, what have you. But we will be breaking those down on individual videos. Today, we're going to go over the broad brush, the sweeping sort of generalizations of what makes each group different from the other groups. And then in future episodes, we will be breaking down the individual sects within some of these categories. Not all of them. We're not going to I don't think we're going to focus on sects within Essenes in the future. Or again, our goal is actually to primarily get to the Shammai and Hillel sort of discourse that, again, a lot of people think they know a lot about, but there's actually a lot of misconceptions there. And so, and that's what our goal is to get to that. So our first sect that we are going to go over tonight is none other than the Essenes.
Oh boy.
I love talking about the Essenes because for a long time, it was sort of thought that Jesus was an Essene.
Yep.
For a long time.
Yep. The Essenes, I'd say, as a group, are the most controversial to discuss because people on what tends to be extreme sides of the issue with respect to opinion, whereas you've got your more scholarly opinions about the Essenes, and then you've got very emotionally invested opinions about the Essenes.
Yeah, and theological investments of the Essenes, and that's an interesting thing. I feel like I have to clarify too, which I didn't think I really would have to, but here I am. There is a difference between the historical opinion and the theological opinion. Theologians are not historians, and historians are not theologians. There's a lot of crossover in a lot of areas between those two categories of scholarship, but they're not synonymous. And many theologians might know a lot of history, but it's very rare that you'll find a historian who is also a theologian. It's usually sort of one or the other, because both are incredibly difficult disciplines in and of themselves. So when we say stuff like, well, that's a theologian's answer to this particular problem, what we mean to say is there's no historical basis for that belief. It is purely built from the theological mindset. and actually an example of this would be like the Trinity. Historically, the Trinity is not in the New Testament historically. And it doesn't appear to be something that's read into the New Testament until much later, approximately 190 years later. But the theologian will say it was always there. And so that's the difference. That's like, okay, well, historically, we know that it wasn't. Like, no one was writing this down with the thoughts of the Trinity. And the theologian would say, yeah, well, no, it was always there. It was always meant to, whether or not the history shows it's there or not. That's kind of like a difference, right? The theologian is a different approach.
Right.
And so that's true with the things like the Essenes. So the Essenes, what you're going to get from historical sources and theological sources are going to be slightly different. And that's where we have this, right? Like thinking that Jesus was basically an Essene. That's a theological opinion. That's actually not a historical opinion.
Yeah. And it's it's an interesting theological opinion because there's not a lot of evidence for it in the teachings of Yeshua. Matter of fact, there's a lot of evidence that he actually taught quite opposite of the Essenes.
Well, so just as a sort of brief overview, and then we'll talk about how that pertains to Jesus in particular. The Essenes, and you'll see I put down here the religious purists. That's because that's what they were. These guys were the highest standards of what we would say today as orthodoxy. That's not a word that they would use of themselves. That's not an ancient word, so it's not a great description, but for the modern mind, they would be considered the highest standards of orthodoxy. One might even go so far as to use the term ultra-orthodox, which some might find that to be a pejorative term. That would be one way to relate to how they were thought of back then. They were very isolationist people. They lived in complete isolation. They had these very close-knit and tight communities. They were communal communities, as in they shared they had no personal property. Everything was shared, everything was burdened together. And the big thing is, by purists, I mean that in the biblical sense. The idea of uncleanliness is not okay to the Essene. The Essene is obsessed with cleanliness, to the point where if they shook hands with a stranger who was not an Essene, even if the man was in a state of ritual purity, they would still mikveh because they came in contact with a not them. And this is evidenced historically and archaeologically. There are mikveh pools everywhere. If you are of the scholarly opinion, which I am, which happens to be the majority scholarly opinion, that the Qumran caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, were written by Essenes, which again is still a sort of debated topic, but by and large, it's more or less accepted that they are Essene manuscripts. And so if we accept that premise, which many scholars do, I need to preface that, many scholars do, then we find that they that was their practice, that they were obsessed with mikvahs, obsessed with hand washings, and not like in the Pharisee sense where they question Jesus about the hand washings. I mean, like all the time, not just before meals, before just about anything.
Yep.
And
I was going to say they even took the abhorrence of uncleanliness to the point of at a certain point in history, at least part of their sect stopped marrying because
so that's very
the
true.
union of husband and wife inherently leaves both in a state of ritual impurity.
I'm actually really glad you brought that up. I wasn't even going to bring that point up, but yeah, there were two primary sects within Essenism, and one of them did no marriage. They were completely celibate, and that source comes primarily from Josephus. Josephus tells us of another sect. Neither sect shunned marriage. It's just the one that didn't marry, they recognized its value, but they themselves did not partake. And the other one sometimes allowed marriage. They were a little bit more lenient towards marriage and would allow for it. But yeah, These guys, again, they would not eat at the same table with anyone other than another Essene. You would never find them touching. There's actually a sort of historical joke. Essenes, we know for a fact that Essenes didn't poop on Shabbat. Ask me how I know.
How do we know this?
Okay, because they prescribed that the distance between the camp or the community and the nearest latrine had to be about 3,000 to 4,000 cubits away from the camp for purity reasons.
Which is beyond a Sabbath day's journey.
Which is beyond a Sabbath day's journey, which means they would not be allowed to poop on Sabbath.
Now, of course, you know that the naysayers are going to point out that the Essenes did not accept the oral tradition, which the distance of a Sabbath day's journey is or could be considered oral tradition, since no such distance is spelled out in the Torah, and so we don't know. They might have alleviated their bowels on Shabbat because they didn't subscribe to the oral tradition.
Basically the Dead Sea Scrolls give us that they accepted the 2,000 cubit Sabbath days journey ruling. Interesting. They did hold to an oral tradition, which is why their purity standards were so high. But what the problem that they primarily had with when it came to the oral tradition was actually because the Sadducees were in charge of the temple. Their main issue was not with the oral tradition. It was primarily with the temple system. And that's why they lived in such isolation. And they also, they had a belief that only holy vessels can be taken to the temple for holy reasons. Whereas, so like just an example, you can't take a normal animal skin with water to the temple. The Essenes believed that you had to specifically had one made that was from an offering with the specific intention to be a water carrying vessel from the temple, and it couldn't have ever been used. And you bring that to the temple and you can fill it with water and then come back with it, or wine or what have you. Whereas the Pharisees thought that was far too expensive of a stringency. So they actually didn't. They were just like, you can come here with whatever carrying vessel that you have to get what you need to have done. And the Essenes disagreed with stuff like that. They disagreed with a lot of temple practices. And so that's actually why they broke away and became. So essentially they were the religious purists. They were the ultra Orthodox. They held themselves in the highest. They gave no room for leniencies in any regard. And we're going to get to it in a second, but the Pharisees were known as the most lenient sect of Judaism at the time. And the Essenes actually call the Pharisees out on this and basically say they make their lives too easy. So they like sort of play like jab at them for taking the easy way out. That's how they say it. Like they're taking the easy way out. So yeah. That's the Essenes, more or less. Like, reasons we know that Jesus was not an Essene. Now, once again, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls really laid a lot of the groundwork for more information about the Essenes, because they basically disappeared after the destruction of the temple. And so not a whole lot was known about them other than what Josephus had written about them. And honestly, he did not write much. They wrote like maybe 3 or 4 sentences about them, and that's it. So we really didn't have a lot of information there.
Yeah, because more or less in the first century, especially towards the end of the first century, they were already insignificant as it was. Mm-hmm. They were not by any means a major sect.
According to Josephus, the largest numbers that they ever achieved was 4,000 in total. So that, if that gives you an idea, yeah, there are only about 4,000 of them at any given point. So, speaking of breaking away from the temple system, that brings us to our next sect that we are going to talk a little bit about. The Sadducees.
Yep.
Sadducees. The aristocrats.
Yep. I forget, and I've mentioned it in an earlier episode, but There's another name Talmudically that they go by, or it's not necessarily the Sadducees, but it was like the precursor to both the Sadducees and the Essenes, believe it or not. I forget the title, but it was a sect that kind of came out of the Maccabean period, as I understand, and
Zadok. Zadokites.
No. It's another title, but essentially, yeah, Zadokites. And they somehow ended up forming both the Essenes and the Sadducees as we know them.
Yeah, more or less. So for those not tracking, there was a high priest named Zadok during the Maccabean period. Actually, excuse me, the Hasmonean period. And he's believed to be the originator of what would become the Saddukites, or the Saddukim, which becomes Sadducees. I'm sure you can see where the leap is there. And the Essenes. And to kind of actually pull back a little bit, back to the Essenes just a little bit. We're not entirely sure where Essene came from. It might originate from a sort of Greek rendition of the word Hasid, which would be Hasidic or like Hasidim. And again, given their ultra orthodox nature, Hasidim sort of translates as like pious ones. So it kind of makes sense. You could say that the Essenes were sort of like the first like Hasids. And we've known that in history. Like Hasidic Judaism more or less rose in 18th century Europe. But that's the modern Hasidic movement as we know it today. There were, throughout other periods of time, groups of Jews known as Hasids. And this is possibly one of them. We don't know for sure, but there's an idea that the Essene name probably comes from Hasid. But that brings us back to Saddukim, the Saddukites, the Sadducees. The aristocrats. There's a reason I give them this name, of course, and all of our people have nicknames that I've given them because I'm obsessed with giving people nicknames. That's what I do. In fact, Brad, you can attest to this. If every contact in my phone is not that person's name, it's a nickname.
Fact.
Big facts. And there's two reasons for that. One, I think it's really fun. Two, it's a safety thing. If my phone gets stolen, all of my friends' names and addresses and everything is not compromised to a stranger. So they'd have to know who, the prophet is in order to actually know whose address they've really achieved, or who they're trying to get a hold of. Like, if that person close to me, is he not? They don't know any. It's kind of a security measure that I take. But so before I jump into another rant historically and stuff, do you want to kind of lead the way on the Saddukites here for a minute? And I'll just kind of jump in between steps.
They're kind of an ancient precursor to the modern day Karaites, who are the Karaites today are not to be offensive, but they're almost as insignificant as the Essenes were at this time. The Karaites are a very small fringe movement that essentially they reject the oral tradition and are scriptural purists in the sense of they definitely stick to the sola scriptura. Now, the Sadducees would be much more extreme in this aspect. As I understand, the Karaites at the very least still accept the rest of Tanakh, given the Psalms and prophets and whatnot, whereas the Sadducees did not. The Sadducees accepted only the 5 books of Moses. That was it. Well,
so, I mean, that's not 100% true. I hate to stop you in the middle of that like that, but that comes from a so basically the church fathers are the ones who said that. And that's because they didn't understand the application of the word Torah. Because back then, believe it or not, the word Torah was often used to refer to all of
the whole of Tanakh,
scripture.
Yeah.
And so there were some Sadducees we've discovered historically that there is actually a major subsect of Sadducees that did accept the prophets in the writings, but they all rejected the oral Torah. In fact, that the primary defining factor of all Sadducees is the rejection of the oral Torah. Many only accepted the 5 books of Moses. That's true, but there was also a sect that did accept the prophets and the writings. To what extent we don't really know. There seems to be a kind of loose acceptance. They treated it like apocrypha, kind of.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I say accept, I mean I'm speaking specifically in terms of like acceptance as a divine and authoritatively binding document.
Yeah.
You know,
there were some Sadducees that still would accept, like Jeremiah, for example. But there's not a lot.
right.
I don't want to lie on the.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. They definitely weren't a majority. It's worth mentioning, but they weren't a majority, which is why I tend not to mention it, because it's like not mentioning the Essenes that were given to more Gnostic philosophies, because they were a small sect. They definitely by no means made up the majority of Essenes, but there were Essenes that were given to more Gnostic philosophies.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Judaism is far from a homogenous group.
Right.
Which actually, funny enough, the Essenes are the most homogenous of all the groups that we're talking about, because they had such strict standards of living, and table fellowship and everything. Like it was very, very organized and orchestrated. And so they were very much more homogenous than any other sect of Judaism in this period of time. For the first century, that is. But yeah, so the Sadducees, the reason I call them the aristocrats, they were kind of wealthy. They were the high class of Jewish men. They were largely Hellenist. They sided with Rome and Greek, largely. Okay, not all, but by and large, for the most part, they were Hellenists. Hellenist, by the way, means pro-Greek culture. Like they were very much for Jewish assimilation into the Greek cultural world that was around them. Something that the Essenes very much rejected, and something that the Pharisees, which we'll talk about later, were a little bit more moderate about. And we'll get more into detail as we get to that particular sect. But the Sadducees particularly were basically loyal to Greek and Rome, having a Jewish heritage by birth. A lot of people know they reject the idea of the resurrection of the dead. They don't believe in an afterlife.
They didn't believe in angels.
Yes, they did not believe in angels. And they had full and total control of the temple system.
Which, so again, it's worth saying, because there were some that did at least accept the prophets. It's very hard to accept the prophets without accepting angels. So there likely were probably some Sadducees who did believe in angels, but few and far between.
It's, again, we're doing sort of broad brushstrokes here. By and large, the defining factors of Sadducees is that they don't believe in the afterlife. But yeah, they had total control of the temple system. In fact, and here's another like little known fact: the Sanhedrin was a majority Sadducees. A lot of people don't know that. And the Pharisees were the minority party of the Sanhedrin, and really of the entire region, more or less. They had a lot of strongholds closer to the north, and they had most of their influence in the diaspora outside of the land of Israel. Because the Sadducees, they were the high priests. They were the priests. They were natural-born Israelites with a strong, background of lineage, money, power. A lot of them were bought and paid for by Rome, and sort of installed as a puppet for Rome. Oh, excuse me. Whoa. Me choking on a spit. I just need beer. That'll fix it. Bought and paid for by Rome. And but Rome knows better than to just install a Roman and try to assert power and control over a region. So they would basically, they're like, hey, you're Jewish. The people like you. You got power and influence. You're already kind of rich, and then you've got a name for yourself. I'm going to give you a ton of money, and you're going to do what I tell you to do. But this way, the people don't revolt against Rome, and you're going to side with me. And they were like, yeah, that makes sense. We like you. We're very Hellenist ourselves. We like this whole assimilation, and we want peace with y'all. So that's kind of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were probably the only ones present at Jesus's at his trial, by the way.
The name I was thinking of, the sect I was thinking of earlier, is the Boethusians. Yeah, that's one of the titles I think referenced in the Talmud, among yes. other things, but it's because of the high priest at the time, the house of Boethus.
I can't remember currently right now off the top of my head what separates them from the other.
Well, what I think it is they the Boethusians were kind of like the overarching generic sect that splintered into subsects, which would have been like the Zadokites and a few others, and ultimately, right. It's kind of like the pyramid goes downhill.
Another key differences before we move on. Little known facts. Sadducees, again, they refused to accept the oral Torah, the traditions of the fathers. They were 100% against the traditions of the fathers. And so for a lot of Christians, actually, that puts you in a really awkward spot, and many Messianics as well, Hebrew roots. Because if Jesus was so against the traditions of the fathers, then he was also basically a Sadducee by category. Right. Which is a very weird position to be in. And the Sadducees also considered the purity laws to only exist within the temple precinct. They did not think that the purity laws applied in any way to the common man or to Judaism at large, the greater whole.
And that would be due to a very literalist interpretation of Torah law.
Right, because they reject the traditions of the fathers. And if you read the Torah, you would think, well, this only applies to the temple. Whereas, the Pharisees, by contrast, and the Essenes, of course, by contrast, even if they only really pertain to the temple, and that may have been their stance, their idea was, well, we're all a family, and we're going to stand sort of in solidarity with the high priests and the priests themselves, who have to cover their heads every day and wash their hands every morning and do mikvahs every, so often. So they joined in hand with their fellow Cohen.
Yeah.
But
there's a level of irony in that, I think. Because ultimately what this means is that if you are, a believer who is coming to Torah, and as is the case with a majority of the Torah observant movement coming out of Christianity right now, we understand we are a minority view here. But if you believe that Torah is applicable to you outside of the temple precinct, even the purity laws at that, then you are in some way the oral tradition. And that can be said for literally all of the Torah practicing movement. In some facet or another, you are accepting an oral tradition, because at some point you won't be able to rationalize or give an answer for why you practice a certain commandment the way that you do. Right on down to tzitzit, right? The idea of tzitzit that you have, of the knots and tassels, the way that it is, that's oral tradition, right? Because that's not described in the Torah.
Even if you put them on your belt loops, you probably tie them in the Sephardic tradition, which is not in the Tanakh.
Right. Exactly.
Which tends to be the case. And the last defining feature of the Sadducees, which sets them apart, the calendar.
This would apply to the Essenes also.
The calendars. The Essenes had their own calendar. The Sadducees had their own calendar.
Yep.
The Pharisees had their own calendar.
Yep.
But the Essenes, by and large, and for a lot of reasons, did agree with the Pharisee calendar, minus Yom Kippur. The way that would be calculated for Yom Kippur in the Pharisee tradition, the Essenes did not agree with.
Well, so then how? So this is going to be the inherent question that I see coming up, though, because naturally you're going to have a lot of Zadokite, a lot of Zadokite practicing Torah practitioners, and this is why I say there's a lot of opinion on it, is because there's the scholarly opinion, and then there's the emotional opinion. There's the emotional attachment to the Essenes that we find, unfortunately, ubiquitous in the Hebrew roots movement. It's kind of like they looked for a sect of Judaism that shook their fist at the Pharisees and their oral tradition the most, and for whatever reason they thought that would be the Essenes, and so they figured that they got to be right then. And the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the Qumran caves among the community plays a big part in this. So how would you square the notion that the Essenes actually observed the Pharisaic calendar with the newly derived calendar that came out of interpreting the book of Enoch and the book of Jubilees? And it does take both together. You can't actually arrive at the calendar that we see today independently from either one of those. It takes both of those documents together in order to form this calendar.
Yeah, so even though we've found those books among the Qumran scrolls and in tiny fragments at that, the community scroll actually has the calendar basically laid out for us. We know exactly what their calendar looked like, and we know how it differed from the Pharisees and the Sadducees calendars. And that's where I say, by and large, we know that the Essenes basically rejected the Pharisees' way of calculating for Yom Kippur. And what that does, though, is that does shift the entire year's calendar to the left, to the right by 2 days, give or take.
Yeah.
Pharisees tend to, and so the Pharisee practice was to make Yom Kippur always fall on either a Wednesday or a Monday, I believe. Like, no matter what the year is, no matter what that calendar is going to look like, Yom Kippur will fall on a Monday or Wednesday. And the Essenes were like, okay, well, that seems a little arbitrary. And so it did change the entire calendar. It moved everything a little bit to the left or to the right. But the Essenes, so far that we can tell, they did celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread immediately following Passover.
Well, and so, yeah, that was going to be the next thing, right? Is the difference in opinion over calendar, which this is important to know. When Paul is speaking about how one man reveres one day and another man another, he's not talking about Sabbath observance. He is most likely referring to the ongoing dispute in his own day between sects of Judaism about this right here. It has everything to do with how one interprets the passage about Passover, right? Yep. Because it depends on whether or not you are interpreting the word Sabbath in the passage as being Passover as the Sabbath, or if it's referring to the weekly Sabbath. Whereas if you think that it's referring to Passover as the Sabbath in question, then obviously the next day following that is where you start, the following process. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you think that it's speaking specifically about the weekly Sabbath, which would have followed Passover later in the week, now you've got a 2 or 3 day variance in the continuing process, and that would be where this comes from, because where you determine which Sabbath it's talking about ultimately affects where Yom Kippur is going to fall.
So I've got a this is from The Letter Writer by Tim Hegg. Page 55, his section on the Sadducees. I'm just going to read this paragraph. It's the bottom of page 55, for those of you who are looking for the reference. While the differences in doctrinal issues between the Sadducees and the Pharisees were pretty clear-cut, the rabbinic literature shows that the practice that in practice, the primary dispute between the two sects pertained to the calendar, as well as to purities. We'll get into purities in a little bit when we actually switch over to the Pharisees topic. The Sadducees interpreted the command to bring the first omer of barley on the day after the Sabbath to mean the day after the weekly Sabbath, or what in modern times we know as Sunday. The Pharisees, on the other hand, took the phrase day after the Sabbath to mean the day after the festival, since the festival of Pesach is itself a Sabbath. This meant that the first omer was taken to the temple the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, not the first Sunday following Pesach. To ensure that the festival always fell on a Sunday, the Sadducees constructed a calendar based upon solar months and solar years for both. The Pharisees, keepers of the traditions, would have no part of this innovative calendar. So the Sadducees actually reinvented the entire calendar to ensure that Passover always fell on a Sunday. Did I read that right? Yeah, on a Sunday. Yeah, to ensure that the festival always fell on a Sunday. So that shifted the entire calendar by a lot of days in many cases. And so between the Pharisees and the Essenes, you got a couple days difference. Between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you have up to a week's difference in calendar day. And that becomes a very important piece of information to note when it comes to Jesus's day of his crucifixion. We'll get into that. Actually, we should probably go ahead and transfer into the Pharisee section here so that we can get to our honorable mentions. But
yep,
those are the biggest things you need to know about Sadducees. Of course, we'll talk a little bit more in depth later on. But the Pharisees, the moderates, and my favorite group, the only group to last after the destruction of the Second Temple and the failed Second Revolt.
Well, the only group that Yeshua ever gave real attention to. I mean, think about that. Oh boy, what was that?
Nothing.
Oh,
No.
okay. Well, in throughout the Gospels, the encounters that we see Yeshua have with other people, we don't really see him encounter Essenes at all. That's not to say that he didn't. We don't see him encounter that many, or any. And as far as we can tell, oh, he's gone again. Okay. It's an elusive one.
As far as we can tell, what?
As far as we can tell, he never spoke to any Essenes. The Sadducees, however, he just didn't give any time to. That was one of those, he gave up the conversation as soon as it began. To phrase what he tells them in modern lingo, he basically tells them, guys, you're too stupid to recognize that you're stupid. You're not worth arguing with, is basically what he tells them. So it's interesting to note that the Pharisees are the ones that he engaged the most with, right? They're the ones that we see him speaking the most with and disputing the most with. They're the ones that he actually tries to reason with here and there because, well, they had more respect, right? He respected them more than he respected the Sadducees. Again, we can't necessarily say that about the Essenes because he never spoke to any Essenes.
The thing too about the Pharisees is they were not the aristocrats. They were much closer to the common man. A lot of them came out of basically middle-class homes. And so their influence, they had a lot of political influence. Don't get me wrong, but they weren't aristocrats. And so they were considered a very viable and more closer to home leader in any given community. And again, especially in the north, in the Galilean region, it's a Pharisee stronghold, and definitely in the diaspora. See, the Sadducees were obsessed and only focused on the temple, whereas the Pharisees, they are more concerned with the immortality of the soul, with the more practical application of Judaism. in everyday life. And that's actually the big defining factor here between the two. Is the Pharisees will take anything in the Torah and apply it in some sort of very practical way to the daily life for a common man. What did you just do?
Oh, I don't know what I just did. That was an accident.
Why? Okay, we're good. Technical difficulties figured out. But yeah, so like Yeshua is talking to the Pharisees primarily because they are the leadership everyone looks up to, especially in the common. The Pharisees had a lot more influence closer to the normal everyday person, and so if they were acting in any hypocritical way, that was a problem. It was a much greater threat than if the Sadducees act in some sort of hypocritical way. It's sort of like, well, I mean, you're an aristocrat. We don't really care about you anyway, and you're kind of doing your thing at the temple. Like, you have no power here. This is the Galilee. Like,
yeah.
Well, yeah,
there are even historical statements that we can see from the Sadducees, kind of explaining about the Pharisees. It's funny, you almost get two opposite statements, but the context is where it's important, because you have statements of the Sadducees kind of explaining that the Pharisees make it too easy on themselves respective to their interpretation of the Torah. But then you have opposite statements saying that they live in an undue hardship, right? Because they weren't actively seeking wealth, and they weren't necessarily the most wealthy upper class. That would be the Sadducees, So the Sadducees looked at the Pharisees and were like, guys, like, do the thing, get the money.
Yeah, get rich, dude. Like, you can. And they largely didn't. They would continue working in trades. Like Paul, a great example. He was a tent maker. Now, Paul probably came from pretty moderate money. He wasn't tent making to live absolutely. He was likely tent making to supplement his otherwise income and to earn his own way in any particular area, so that he could say that I didn't have to live off of you to survive. Something like in the corner of my eye, it keeps it's bothering me. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's just me, but it's distracting. But so the Pharisees, but they're the moderates. They're the political moderates. They believe in the oral tradition. They believe heavily in the tradition of the fathers, and they also are trying to be sort of this middleman between, like, the Hellenists and the Jews. They absolutely believe in the Jewish nation as continuing to be a unique and separate Jewish nation, and not integrating into the Hellenist society, but at least having peace with them. Whereas the Sadducees were all about, we need to just go ahead and fully integrate. Like, we're outliers here, and you're embarrassing us. The Pharisees were like, well, no, we like being outliers, right? That's what makes us unique. It's what keeps us strong. But there's no reason to be at war with these people. Right. And so, as far as the teachings of the Pharisees were concerned, a number of things that characterized them, primarily of the immortality of the soul, of course, reward and punishment after death, the existence of angels, and the idea of divine providence, but also table fellowship is a big thing. In fact, 67% of all halachic rulings from Pharisees are to do with table fellowship. So that was actually a very big thing. Typically, like, known Pharisees, they didn't really have any problems with mingling with common folk, but they would not have table fellowship with sinners for sure. And this is one of those giveaways that we know that Yeshua was likely a Pharisee, because the Pharisees bring that up. They're like, well, hold on. Why is your dude eating with sinners? We don't do that. Which, again, if he was a Sadducee, well, I don't know if that would happen anyway, because they were aristocrats. Essenes definitely would not have done it at all. So that leaves you with very little options. And the fact that the Pharisees are like, hey, that's weird. tells us that they considered him to be a Pharisee. Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought it up.
Yeah. Yep. Another aspect to them, too, is that the Pharisees have, at least so far as we can tell, they have the last link in the line of smicha, right? It's not to say necessarily that no Sadducees had an actual smicha from that dates back to Moses, but at least as far as the first century in the Mishnaic period, what we know is that the line of ordination from Moses, right? Because that's how the Sanhedrin even came about, is you had Moses appointing the judges, right? That's Moses giving ordination, and then those judges gave ordination to their students, and this just carried on over time through the time of the New Testament, right up into the period afterward, where you have Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the last in that line of succession. So I've not read the totality of the Talmud, so I don't know if the Talmud ever makes mention of a Sadducee who was in that line of smicha. But so far as I know, there weren't any Sadducees mentioned in that line of smicha.
If the Sadducees, I mean, some of them did, but the problem was after the destruction of the temple, which Rabbi Akiva lived past.
Yes.
After the destruction of the temple, they all sort of ceased to exist. And so even if they did have smicha, it didn't get passed. Their tradition was never kept. The rabbinic tradition, rather the Pharisaic tradition does continue to live on. It does continue to get passed because the Pharisees were much more focused on the everyday practical life of Jews everywhere, all over the world. To the Sadducees, the temple was the center for worship. To the Pharisees, the temple was the center for worship, but you're also a temple, and you can take your temple everywhere. Mm-hmm. And you should take your temple into the world and bring heaven wherever you're at. And that was the difference between the Pharisee and the Sadducees. And that should sound familiar to a lot of Christians out there. My body is a temple. That's a Pharisee's teaching.
It's fascinating, actually, because so the verse that comes to mind, right, is the one where Hashem is telling his prophet that I will always reserve for myself a portion of my people. So you have this terrible thing that happens in 70 AD, right? Mm-hmm. You have the destruction of the temple. Who lived past it? Who did Hashem
basically just the Pharisees
for himself?
Yeah, and you know, to that credit again, we as historians, we accredit that great success in passing is because they were so, instead of being temple centric to the physical literal temple, which they are very much that, but that's not the center of their lives. The center of their lives is very much the individual, your own bodily temple, and that resonated with a lot of common people. And so it was everywhere. It was everywhere else in the world. The Sadducees could never have that kind of reach because they only focused on the actual physical temple. And again, they didn't even believe that any of the purity laws were applicable outside of the temple complex. And so even if there were a Sadducee in the diaspora, he would look like any normal Greek guy walking around. He would honestly not be very distinctively Jewish in any way. And so then of course the Essenes would, I don't think there's a single Essene that ever lived outside of the land of Israel. So, that's not even really something that catches on. So once the land of Israel gets completely sacked by the Romans, scorched earth and salted fields, and the land of Israel no longer is Israel. And then they give it the name Palestine, as an insult. That's when, those sects of Judaism cease to exist. But yeah, so what we know today as rabbinic Judaism is absolutely 100% the product of Pharisaic Judaism. It is not a one-to-one equivalent, but it is incredibly close. It is the direct offspring of. Again, not a one-to-one equivalent. Of course, modern Orthodoxy, there's a lot of things that we have today. Halakhic
is subject to progress. right? There hasn't been very much in the way of redaction, but there has been progression, which is why it would look different from how it was back then, is progress of thought, but not redaction. They haven't redacted very much, if anything.
There's, I mean, and by redaction, I would push back a little bit on that and say that after the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin began to meet at Yavna, and the Pharisees, we have Rabban Gamliel, who became the Sanhedrin president.
Yep.
They didn't redact, but they did loosen a lot of the rulings post temple destruction. Because after that, I was like, okay, living this really strict way that we've been doing for a while might work for us because we sort of have the time, money, and energy to do it and the experience. But now we don't even have a central place for Judaism to have like its authority grab anymore. That's been taken out from under us. So they took that time to kind of loosen a lot of restrictions and make Judaism even easier for the common man. And so, the Pharisees are very much known for their leniency, for being very moderate, for being peacekeepers. A lot of them were largely not pro war. So they weren't like zealots or anything. They were moderates. They believed more in sort of keeping the peace. I believe actually, I might be wrong, but I'm gonna say the quote anyway. I can't remember who said it, but I think it was a Pharisee that said this. Excuse me. Peace is so important to Hashem that even Hashem steps aside for it.
Definitely. That sounds like something a Pharisee would say.
I'm fairly certain a Pharisee said that, but that's the idea. This idea is, peace is the single most important thing to God. Shalom Bayit, peace in the house. In Sephardic circles, peace in the house is so important that if between husband and wife, that is, and since the home belongs to the wife, if the wife does not want to keep kosher in certain particular aspects, you as the husband, in the name of Shalom Bayit, will follow whatever it is your wife wants to do as far as kosher laws go, or the lack thereof, because that's how important peace is to like the Pharisaic mindset. Now that's not true in every Jewish home, but by and large, like in some Sephardic circles, I know that if they want to keep basic kosher, but they're okay with mixing meat and dairy, or rather the wife wants to continue mixing meat and dairy and the husband doesn't, it's not the husband's place to say. The wife has domain over the house as far as like the house stuff like that, like cooking and everything. And so it's not up to him. And for Shalom Bayit, he has to give that up. It's actually, it's very incredible. It's that amount of leniency and sort of ease and give in it for the sake of the name of peace is very Pharisaic in its trait. And we see this in Paul. We see Paul use language like this, where if it at all possible for you, do this and that. But if it's too much of a trouble, then don't worry about it. That kind of language is Pharisaic language, because Paul was a Pharisee. It totally makes sense for him to be very lenient in certain things, but also very strict in like the big important stuff, of course.
Right. And that's the leniency and strict thing, and that'll be a conversation that we get more in depth in with Hillel and Shammai, because even though one was known more for leniency and the other for strictness, there were areas where they crisscrossed.
Yeah, and what we mean by leniency, by the way, is sort of like the difference between lighting 8 candles on Hanukkah versus lighting 1 candle on Hanukkah. Like, that's the difference. It's very subtle differences. We're not saying big, massive, wide differences. And believe it or not, halakhically speaking, you're only required to light a single candle every night of Hanukkah. But the more like beautification of the holiday is to light 8 one candle for every night that has passed. And that's like just an example, where Hillel might say, well, a Sabbath day's travel should be 2,500 cubits, and Shammai might say, no, it's 2,000 strictly. It's just very little give. It's these little things here and there. In the grander scheme of things, we're talking about a culture and a time and a place that's nothing like our modern world, and so we can't compare the word lenient to how we understand lenient today,
right?
Which is not really the same thing. In fact, one of my favorite quotes by a historian, funny enough, I can't remember his name right now, but the quote is, "The past is a foreign country, and they do things differently there."
That's like that.
Quote. That's my favorite quote.
I like it
a lot. But yeah, that's the Pharisees, moderate, middle class. And their calendar was the majority calendar.
Yep.
Which tells us that another reason why Jesus might have been most likely a member of the Pharisee party is because he seems to be celebrating Passover while everybody else is, because the rest of the world celebrated Passover on the Pharisees' version of the calendar, which is why we call it the majority calendar. Whereas the Essenes and the Sadducees, these were localized calendars. The Sadducees, again, didn't have a presence in the diaspora, so people weren't traveling from all over the world to do the Sadducees' version of Passover.
Right.
Anyway, we're at the hour. Is that?
I was going to say honorable mentions. We can go through those quick.
Yeah, real quick honorable mentions. There are a couple other sects. The Zealots, the extremists. They were largely Jews with religious. Well, not really religious. They're mostly known for being militant and
freedom fighters,
nationalist.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Pro-Israel Jews. Yeah, very, very militant nationalists. The scribes. These are the lawyers. These are the guys who know the law in and out, letter to letter. These are the Pharisees' best friends. Because the Pharisees rely very heavily on the oral tradition, and the scribes were experts at knowing both. And so the Pharisees were always hand in hand with the scribes. There's a reason why Jesus lumps the scribes and the Pharisees together. And then the Am Haaretz. This is the one that we cannot forget. Am Haaretz, the common folk. Am Haaretz literally means people of the earth in Hebrew. And these are just normal, regular, everyday people. Not aristocrats, poor, regular, common, working folk. Honestly, a lot of these Am Haaretz don't care about any of these other higher sects. They're just trying to live their life. They just want to be told, this is the correct thing I got to do. And right now, I'm just focused on earning the money for my family and making a living. Honestly, all this other crap I don't care about. Think of it like modern politicians today don't represent the majority of the country. The majority of the country is very much like, you know what? I honestly could give no craps. I'm just trying to work. I just hate taxes. Let me just leave me alone. That's the Am Haaretz. It's the person who doesn't really belong to a party. And they're the most important because they're honestly the 90% of all Jews in this time are Am Haaretz. Not really part of the Pharisee discussion between Sadducees and Essenes and Shammai and Hillel. They don't care about that stuff. They're busy plowing the fields and making stuff work. And mother died in childbirth. They're worried about stuff like that. They're not worried about these other philosophical things that are happening that we get to enjoy today because we live in such a prosperous modern age.
Right.
Yeah. So,
granted, they probably still lived according to the oral tradition in some capacity, again, because the Pharisees were the ones who had the most contact with the common folk.
Yes, the common folk are actually the reason, again, the Pharisees' legacy lives on, because the common folk were living according to the Pharisee way, whether they realized it or not. All right, so I got let's open it up for just 5 more minutes to a couple of questions. We're looking around in the comments. What is happening right now? As our producer's going wild. Oh yeah, that quote has officially locked into my mind palace. Brilliant. Again, I love that quote.
Somebody else who has a mind palace.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Also very, very good. Yeah, I love the mind palace. I remember. You know what? The mind palace is super cool. My other Brad friend. I bet he could still remember the full grocery list that I asked him to memorize using the mind palace technique 11 years ago, like 10 or 11 years ago. Like we were in college and I was like, oh yeah, you got to try this. It's a memory technique. Here it is. Do this. Here's a simple grocery list. You got 5 minutes, memorize it. To this day, I bet he still knows everything on that grocery list because it was.
We got to test that.
It just became like, it was like 5 years ago. I asked him about it and he still remembered everything. He was like, oh yeah, spaghetti, toast. Like he was going through the whole list. And I was like, wow, you still remember the whole list.
You don't even remember it. I bet you he does because you don't.
No, I told him to make the mind palace. I didn't make it for myself. So I know a couple of the stuff on there from, because he tells me, but it was his mind palace and he still remembers it.
Nice. That is such a cool technique. I love it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. I hope the next couple of sex talks can be equally good. Because I mean, really, it feels like we've gone over a lot of information tonight. We've honestly just hit the wave tops. Yeah. All of the information I've gone over was about 4 pages in this book. Yeah, actually, like four exact pages in this book. That's wild to think about. Actually, that was only so little. But yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of information, but we really did not barely scratch the surface. And so I can't wait until we get to break down the individual sects themselves and really like get some of the details out there. So they basically accepted something like the Julian calendar. Yeah, a lot of the common folks, and like Judaism today still follows what is essentially a Christian calendar. They don't really have a problem with, Monday through Friday, January through December, the setup. They don't mind using the calendar.
I think he means the insistence of like Passover always falling on a Sunday.
Oh, is this in reference to the Sadducees? Because the Sadducees.
Because it's kind of like, how Thanksgiving always falls. It's always the last Thursday of November, right? So there's no date ascribed to it. It's just the last Thursday of November.
Yeah, but the Sadducees would change the entire calendar to ensure that the 14th day of Nisan, the month of Nisan, would be on Saturday, so that on Sunday would be the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the Omer.
You mean like such changes as like interrupting the 7-day week to start the week over on the first day of the month?
I cannot confirm that, but that sounds like something that they would do. All I know is
that every Shabbat falls on the what is it, the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th?
No, the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th.
Depends on whether or not you count the non-day. Because there's no moon, so it's not a real day.
I don't even, the calendar topic stresses me out. I'm even talking about it. I can't stand how many calendars are out there. And it's like, dude, Judaism figured this out years ago. Like, just whatever. Any of the other like Hebrew root movements that follow the completely different calendars and everything are basically doing what the Sadducees did and are essentially citing themselves with Sadducees. So
it's crazy that that's the case, right? So you had, think about this, right? You had all of these different sects of Jewish practice, which culminated kind of in the outgrowth of the followers of Yeshua, and the Pharisees are all that lived beyond that point, and then Christianity became a separate religion. And now, in the grander scheme of time, you're having this resurgence back to Torah, and Christians coming out of the church into Torah are reinventing the old sects.
It's
kinda
funny how
crazy.
they're resurrecting sects of Judaism that died with the Second Temple. It's purely because they refuse to accept whatever version of Judaism happens to be around today.
They refuse to accept that God preserved Pharisees.
Particular, yeah. Which again was the party of Yeshua. Again, I know that's hard for a lot of people to accept, but I will continually and forever and always point people to this amazing book, Jesus the Pharisee by Harvey Falk. Rabbi Harvey Falk, I should add. Honestly, it bothers me that he didn't put rabbi in front of his name here, because he is one. He mentions
he's a humble man.
He's it's honestly not that large of a book. He's not like, it's a fairly simple, easy to read setup. It's incredibly scholastic. He did a lot of research. It took him like 14 years to write this book, because he just wanted to be so careful, because he's not a believer. He's not a believer in Jesus. He doesn't believe Jesus is Messiah. And so as an Orthodox rabbinic Jew, he was like, this topic is incredibly sensitive, and so I am not going to just flippantly write a book about this topic. I will be absolutely thorough, because I know what I'm getting myself into here by making this such a claim. So it's very, very carefully written, very well studied. Took him ages to write it, and it's really not that long, but it's incredible. It's excellent. And it's like a hostile witness, of right. Just like, hey, this is a Jewish opinion from a scholastic point of view and historical one, where he's like, yeah, Jesus was one of us. Like, what are you guys freaking out? What are you guys freaking out so bad about? Yeah. And so it's 12 past the hour. We should go ahead and close it up. Once again, we are definitely going to do the after parties in the Discord after this. So if you are a Patreon supporter, you get access to that. If you don't have access to the after parties and you want access to the after parties, Patreon memberships start at just $1 a month, $12 for the entire year. And you can come join us after the show. You can roast us. You can ask us questions. We can talk more about the subject we just talked about. You get to sit down with us one-on-one, in the Discord. And even if you're not a supporter, join the Discord anyway. We're all there. We're on there all the time. People are always asking us questions, and we're always in there. We have a bunch of very incredibly intelligent alternate media staff members that are on the Discord, who can answer your questions if we can't. And often we can't because we're just busy. But we've got lovely people in the Discord from many different faiths, all of which very credible resources to have and to use. Please utilize the Discord resource. It's very much amazing. Oh, the meme of the week. Oh, you know what? All right. Yep, I got to do this now.
While you're doing that, I will also say about the after parties for anybody who's been watching tonight. Will Walkie has been missing from the TikTok community, and there's been an ongoing search for him. So the after parties would also be a place where you can give us any information about his whereabouts. This is for those of you who are completely lost on this. This is an inside joke. So take it for what it is. It's hilarious, and that's why we've been toying around with the screen all night. But seriously, if you find him, though, come let us know in the after parties.
Okay, there's our meme of the week. I picked something, and it's possibly slightly provocative, but whatever. I think it's pretty funny.
It is.
So, Thunderdome Aaron, you are the winner of the meme of the week. Congratulations. You get brownie points. Your brownie points will be in the mail. But yeah, all right. And I think think that's it for announcements. Everyone knows about the book club, the book giveaway already.
Yep.
I think we're good.
Yeah. No, yeah. We're always looking for ideas for new content, and you guys are always faithful to give us ideas. We love that. We thank you for that. Continue to do that, please. If any topic comes up in conversation with you and others, or if we say something that makes you think of something else, doesn't matter what it is. If it comes to mind and you want to hear us talk about it, please email it to us. Patron supporters always get first preference in that. So, because that we do try and make sure we prioritize those who are donating. And with that said,
and the donators do get access to exclusive content. I have a Mark historical commentary. You have a commentary also being worked on through Genesis right now.
Yep.
There's a couple of certain videos that we made that were exclusive to Patreon supporters only on very particular and maybe sensitive topics.
Yep.
Articles on our website, alternatemedia.com. There are certain articles that are available only for supporters. So there is exclusive content. So if you're wondering about getting what you are paying for, we definitely have things that we've been making that get more bang for your buck. I think that's it. I think that's finally it.
All right.
we should go ahead and go into the after parties before it takes all night.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. We thank you all for joining us as always. We do hope to see you next time. Hope to see you maybe Sunday for Waypoint, and hope that this has enriched you in some capacity. With that said, L'chaim.
L'chaim.